just to say, part of the reason why we're doing this is because of the times we're in as well as the commemoration we're in. And I want to just give you some of my own little connections here as mayor. I didn't realise today, until today, the role that the mayor at the time in 1922, Peter de Lucre, took in the events of that day. But on the chain I wear tonight, the medallion here was a gift of W.T. Cosgrave. This medallion here, W.T. Cosgrave, to the people of Kilkenny in 1959. And maybe some of you know it, maybe some of you don't know it, but W.T. Cosgrave obviously was the first president, prime minister, or really our first Taoiseach. And W.T. Cosgrave was better known as Willie Cosgrave. And Willie Cosgrave was elected unopposed as a Member of Parliament in the 1918 election to Westminster for the constituency of Kilkenny. And W.T. Cosgrave, or Willie Cosgrave as he was known at that time, his election agent was a man called Tom Crotty. And Tom Crotty was my great-grandfather. And on the chain I wear tonight are the names of former mayors of the city, some of whom are with us here tonight, and I'm delighted to see them here. But on this chain are the names of two of Tom Crotty's sons, two of Tom Crotty's grandsons, and when I finish up, there'll be two of Tom Crotty's great-grandsons. And so today is very special on a whole number of fronts. But the French talk about the French Revolution and the forming of the Republic. And the Republic is one of those things that the French, every time things go wrong, they have a new Republic. And they're actually on the 5th Republic. In Ireland, I actually believe, and maybe some of you won't agree with this, but I actually believe that the First Irish Republic ended on the 28th of November 2010. Because Collins, who was our leader, who was our First Minister for Finance, who brought us sovereignty, on that night we lost it. We had to hand it over to someone else to mind it. And so on that night, our first, as I say, the First Irish Republic ended. And I believe that the times we live in now are very similar to the times we're talking about tonight, whereby we're trying to regain our independence. We're trying to regain our sovereignty, where we are charged with the task and the challenges as Collins and the people, the men and women of that time, were challenged to do things that weren't always popular, that weren't always in what all the people wanted, and face real problems and real difficulties. And we again are at that point whereby we have to face into the wind. We have to be strong enough to find the strength to regain our sovereignty. And by doing that, we will regain our republic. And so tonight is not just about history, because history of itself teaches us nothing unless we're prepared to listen and to learn. And tonight is about that opportunity to remember those people of 90 years ago, to be inspired by those people of 90 years ago, and to use that inspiration to forge us on in the task ahead, to build a new republic from the ashes of the old. So that's what tonight is about for me, and I'm delighted that so many people came out on a cold February night to listen to these wonderful speakers. Now, the next speaker is a man called Michael Doran. Michael is a lecturer. He's one of the founding members of the Collins Society, and his theme tonight is Democratic Revolution. Ladies and gentlemen, will you show your appreciation for Michael Doran?
Yeah, just take it like that, yeah. Thank you, Mayor, and he forgot to mention that I'm from Wexford, so I'd just like to congratulate you that it's a very impressive venue, but we've a much bigger opera house in Wexford. And also, I didn't realise there was an upstairs part, so if I don't, because of the lights, I won't be able to look up, so I'll direct most of my speech to the people in the cheaper seats down here. Michael Collins is often portrayed and rightly so, as a military figure, and you see in the pictures around us, that's the public and popular image of him and the romantic image of him. But his contribution to Irish history goes beyond just the mere wearing of uniform and giving orders in a military sense. He was the driving force of a democratic revolution, and that's what I want to speak about and put into some sort of context. If you go back 90 years and trying to understand the world that people lived in, I mean, most of those people have grown up in a world in which there were kings, emperors, kaisers, czars, in which the idea of power came from the top down and not from the bottom up. And the idea of changing that whole system, turning it upside down, a whole new generation of leaders was emerging across Europe. In Ireland, you can take it from any part of the political spectrum, whether it's from Arthur Griffith or to James Connolly, but new ideas were emerging. And it had to take some form and some sort of democratic form. And the First World War changes everything. It changes the whole history of Europe and the world, and it completely changed Irish history. Without it, probably no Easter Rising and all the results that have flowed from that. But the state that was founded, the system that we have established, is based on a democratic change and a democratic revolution. And Collins is at the centre of that, and I'll just explain it. Collins, in 1917-18, sought to help take over a battered organisation that had been defeated militarily in 1916. But the military defeat couldn't defeat the political idea. And the political idea was the political idea of a people, of a democratic state, selected by the people and representative of the people. And the new Sinn Féin that was founded, trying to broaden out that appeal, sought to try and articulate that view. And they went on to win a general election in 1918 and sweep and completely transform Irish politics. Many people were shocked that Sinn Féin had the gall or even the temerity to even suggest it would establish an alternative state. In fact, they were laughed at and ridiculed by their opponents, whether Home Rulers or Unionists or the British press. And internationally, no one thought Sinn Féin could have any chance of success. And simply, they would make some sort of compromise on Home Rule with Britain. But the Sinn Féin leadership was determined to plough ahead and establish a new alternative state. And they drew from lessons in history that had already existed, that the collective will of the people can be greater than any emperor or king or a force of arms bearing down on them. They could look back to 40 years before to the impact of the Land League, and even here in Kilkenny, and certainly in Wexford, that there would have been a very active organisation of the land movement. And that forced change upon a reluctant British government and completely transformed the whole landowning system of Ireland. Now, the lesson of the 1870s and 1880s was visited again by Sinn Féin in 1918, 1919. They moved forward to create a new republic. But there was a very important principle at stake. It could be achieved militarily, and on the same day that the Dáil met, on 21st of January 1919, two policemen were shot in Tipperary, Soloheadbeg, which inaugurated the phase known as the War of Independence. And that's one aspect of it. But more importantly, the majority of people in any conflict do not take up arms, do not wear uniforms, they're not involved, they're not in the battle line. They're involved in a sense, an even more important struggle, maintaining the civilian aspect of the war. And without it, no army can survive. And so, as Sinn Féin sought to establish a new state, which people believed couldn't happen, Michael Collins, and I mean, you have to give credit to the people of the time, because this is a time when the divisions of 1922, 21, 22 don't arise. So there's a unity of purpose among people who in 1922 would go their different ways. So we have to see them at a time when this collective will is now bearing down and moving forward. So the idea of establishing a republic, establishing a democratic state is now being developed. And to establish that, they need finance. And the Minister earlier referred to the national loan and the success of that. And a very important principle was established by that national loan. And Collins, as Minister for Finance, were at the centre of it. I'll just explain. They knew that they had to, if they were going to set up an alternative state, they had to fund it. Now, already they had the pretense of a state, they were establishing government ministries, but they had to pay for it, and they had expenses. So, for example, the President, his salary in 1919 was £500. The 7 government ministers each had a salary of £350. And the most shocking thing is the TDs didn't have any salary at all. That's changed. But but they did have expenses, and that changed too. But it had to be paid for, and it cost an estimate of £25,000 was the estimated cost to run a government officially. and it was going to cost a lot more if they were going to realise their ambitions. So where to get the money? And this comes back to a very important principle, which all revolutionary movements have to deal with. Where do you fund it? I mean, if you have the will of the people through the ballot box and you establish a state, how are you going to articulate that state? Well, in that regard, to get the money, the alternatives would have been, for example, taxation. Now, the whole idea of tax, we like to pay it, but could they levy more tax? Well, they weren't sure whether it was practical. Could they divert taxation from the British Exchequer? Well, practically, how could that be achieved? Some suggested possibly using armed force. But this is the central issue, and Collins rejects it, because if an armed force or an armed group starts to behave in a divisive way or even a criminal way, it undermines and dilutes the democratic mandate, and it undermines the essence of what they're trying to achieve. So Collins was the driving force behind the national loan, because it did establish an important principle, that it brought in the people. If the people could be the contributors to this national loan to fund the state, it showed that there was a belief in that state, and that people were prepared to sacrifice, make a personal sacrifice, a personal contribution to establish that state. And that was the important principle, because the road, they could have gone down a very different road, and it could have led to division, bitterness, criminality, and other such things. So in a sense, by involving the people and by establishing the national loan, it meant that the new state, the new government, was established on a firm financial backing, but also it had a democratic mandate. And Collins, as Minister of Finance, drove that national loan. And once it started from the summer of 1919, and you will see archive footage, but the Irish Film Board made for £600 in 1919 a very short piece of film, and you'll see Collins stamping the national loan certificates. And they organised advertisements across Ireland. 22 provincial newspapers carried full-page advertisements for the loan. The only paper, the Cork Examiner, I was going to say national paper, but it wasn't national at that stage. But they were the only one of the sort of bigger circulation papers to carry a national loan, and they were shut down within days. So many people took great risks. And it displayed a sort of a bravery on the part of ordinary people. Now, if you take it 1919, it was after the First World War, there was economic disruption, there was disorder, there was no certainty as to what the future would be at all, and yet people, in the time of hardship, were prepared to make a contribution. And even though the contributions could have been £5, £10, or up to 100, I mean, they allowed people to make the smallest donation or the largest donation. But the point is, people were making a sacrifice, and Collins was determined to honour that pledge, that the state would repay those loans. And the important principle was established. And over the next year, Collins saw that national loan carried through to fruition. And by the time it was actually had been collected, once he called halt to it on July 17, 1920, 150,000 people had contributed to that loan. That's 15% of basically all households in Ireland. And that's an enormous contribution. And as the Minister said earlier, that it far exceeded their original expectations. To put it into context, the old Home Rule Party that had been the dominant force in Ireland up to 1918, they had, when they achieved 10,000 in a loan in collection, they had considered that an outstanding success. So for Sinn Féin in 1920 to greatly exceed that would in today's terms be worth millions of euro, and it allowed them to fund the revolution. And that principle allowed them to go on and change the whole course of history. Without that, many things would have been different. So, for example, as 1920 escalated into violence, and as Lloyd George and Churchill resorted to terror and then counter-terror and the escalating cycle of violence, well, the IRA response and retaliations and the campaign could have been very seriously undermined if it hadn't the proof of the people behind them didn't exist. And that principle had been very firmly established. And one newspaper, the Daily Herald, said in 1920, made a very important statement, about what was happening in Ireland. And it articulates also what was happening, what people are starting to think in Britain. It made a statement along the lines that the invisible republic exists in the hearts of the men and women of Ireland and wields a greater authority than all the tanks and machine guns of King George. And for a British paper to come out and make a statement like that was showing that, in a sense, that the war was winning over large sections of people. Many people in Britain began to turn against the war because they now saw Sinn Féin was a credible force establishing a credible state, and that Lloyd George would have to deal with it eventually. It also forced many across Ireland to come to terms with this. Many of the old Home Rule Party that thought that Sinn Féin was an aberration. The Southern Unionist leadership, and even if you see it through their main paper then at the time, the Irish Times, they began to also accept the view that Sinn Féin was likely to be the government force in Ireland. So the idea had been very firmly established, and even though there probably was, some of their opponents allege that intimidation did take place, and probably maybe there are cases where people did make money, maybe out of fear, intimidation. The general overall proof concludes that overall most people contributed willingly, and the willing sacrifice established a democratic principle. Without that, Collins and the rest of the revolutionary leadership probably would have been in a much weaker position than in 1921. So within a year of all of this happening, Lloyd George was forced to come to a concession and accept a political solution, and accept that Sinn Féin had won the right to represent the new Irish state, and accept the idea that a new Irish state would have to be maintained. And in a sense, as some historians have pointed out, that Collins's democratic revolution forced Britain to look at itself. I mean, 1920-21, was it going to be an empire in which it governed over many unwilling peoples, or was it going to be a democracy? So in a sense, the Irish Revolution helped bring about change in Britain as well. So with that in mind, the point I'm trying to make here is that Collins, by drawing in thousands of people into the Irish political struggle, most of whom never took up arms, most of whom never saw violence, but through their own sacrifice and personal contribution, made as valuable and important contribution to the new democracy, and allowed the people to have full self-determination. And in that way, Collins's greatest contribution was to really bring about, Abraham Lincoln's statement that it was democracy for the people, by the people. I think there's another part of it too, but anyway, of the people. But you get the point. So in a sense, that's the point. That when you look at Collins in uniform, and often great leaders are often portrayed in uniform, even though they were civilian leaders in reality. It's easy to forget their other contributions. So Collins as Minister of Finance, Collins' role in that completely transforms Irish politics. And the basis since then of the Irish state has been that it is based on the democratic will of the Irish people, and everybody who's ever had to question that has had to accommodate and accept that. And on that basis, I will leave it. All right. Thank you.